everyone. Back in February, Autumn and I spent time in Belfast, Northern Ireland. We were invited there to facilitate speculative fiction workshops with a number of groups of people who had survived the conflict there. One of the people we spent the most time with in Belfast was Laurence McKeown. Laurence is an incredible artist and playwright who has spent much of his artistic life telling stories about the people behind what's often called the Troubles, or what we called the conflict. In case you didn't know, the conflict in Northern Ireland dates back centuries. The most recent iteration began in the late 1960s as the Unionists or Loyalists wanted Northern Ireland to remain part of the United Kingdom. The Loyalists were mostly Protestant, and on the other side were the Irish Nationalist Republicans, who were mostly Catholic, like Laurence. The Irish Nationalists wanted Northern Ireland to leave the UK and join a united Ireland. So it's this political and sectarian conflict that got dubbed the Troubles, and it lasted from the late 1960s to the late 1990s. It's this conflict which led Laurence to join the Irish Republican Army, also known as the IRA, or the acronym. So he joined in 1973, So 3 years after that, in an act of IRA militancy, Laurence would fire his rifle at a police car. One officer was slightly injured in the attack, and Laurence was sentenced to life in prison. So while inside the prison, he participated in a hunger strike that was aimed at restoring political prisoner status for those in prison like him, who were there for offenses related to the conflict. And he also participated in several other protests, which we're about to hear about. And he was released in 1992 after a campaign which successfully argued how the IRA political prisoners were being incarcerated indefinitely, while non-political offenders were set free much earlier. So we're leaving a ton of history out here. There's so much to read if you want to go deeper, and we are going to include lots of links in our show notes. But that's the main thing to know before playing this interview with Laurence. I think the other thing we just want to say is Laurence has a stunning, lovely Irish accent, and so this is an episode that we really recommend. Just listen to it. Don't try to listen to it and multitask and do other things if the Irish accent is going to be a new sound for your ears. We really learned how to hear it, and you can do the same if you just listen and drop in, let yourself actually hear what Laurence is sharing. This is a deep dive into a really political moment of importance in our history, our shared history. Enjoy.
I grew up in a very rural area, about 20 miles from here. A very mixed area, religion-wise. And I think people often think of the conflict here in religious terms, but for me it's never been. It's about politics. But religion has been used, as colonialism and imperialism has used difference anywhere in the world, whether it's religion, tribal difference, skin colour, language, as a way to divide. So I grew up, and I say that because many other people wouldn't have had that same experience. They would have grew up in very maybe Catholic area, nationalist area. So it was a very idyllic upbringing, in the sense of being blissfully unaware of things. We lived in a house that had no electricity, had no running water, but that would have been the norm then. You had outdoor toilets, you had a large tin bath that you bathed in once a week or whatever. You had lights that ran off paraffin, but you didn't think about those things at that time because basically everybody was the same. You knew the person who had the phone, so you could go on from there. And really that was life until about 12 years of age, and then they were building a motorway and it was going through our house, so we had to move.
Oh wow.
And my grandmother lived about 2 miles down the road, so my father started to build the house there. And it's interesting how you're living through a moment, a historical moment, and not being aware of it, because the civil rights movement was starting at that time. in 1968, 69. And started by students here in Belfast in terms of the long march that they did in January 69 from Belfast to Derry. And other people, trade unionists and Republicans and some liberal Protestants who were at that time campaigning for civil rights, and basically their demands were one man, one vote, because at the time, and it was one man rather than one person. At that time, while there was a voting system, it depended on property. So if you owned 7 properties, you had 7 votes. You owned 20 properties. If you didn't own any property, you didn't have a vote.
Wow.
So generally the Catholic community didn't own much property, so therefore they didn't get a vote. Or even in areas like Derry, where Catholics and nationalists would have been in the majority, the whole council boundaries were gerrymandered, as the word is called. So there'd always be an inbuilt unionist majority, even though it was in a city where it was mainly Catholic. And
Can
one of
I
the
ask
other
a quick question about that? Did the Catholic Church own property and have a vote?
the Catholic Church owns a lot of property. I'm not sure in terms of their voting and how it worked. Obviously, a priest would have it.
Yeah.
But
That's interesting.
They certainly own a lot of property.
Yeah.
And generally kept quiet about things, with a few notable exceptions of people, but individuals. But one of the other demands on the civil rights was an end to discrimination in employment and housing. And at that time, if you were looking to build a house, you had to submit plans for the house and where you were going to build it, and you submitted it to your local council. And that's generally where the discrimination then happened, because the council was elected representatives. So in our case in Antrim, elected representatives were largely unionist. So my father, who was a fan driver, lorry driver, very quiet man, very inoffensive. I mean, my parents' generation kept their heads down, and their parents. And I think what happened was in the 60s, for a whole number of reasons. You even remember like the anti-Vietnam protests, the riots in Paris. No, there's a general sort of global uprising, or certainly there was an impact. But anyway, my father, had to leave the house because there was a motorway going to go through it, and he worked with this guy who's a Protestant guy, Billy Burns, and he had recently built a house just a few miles away. So my father says, would you give me the plans? And he would photocopy them or do whatever with them and get them submitted, and it would save him money from trying to buy an architect or whatever. And Billy, to his credit, gave him the plans, and my father submitted them, and the council rejected them on something like 39 counts of why you couldn't build this house. And it's probably the only time my father ever took any sort of proactive energy out of desperation, and went to a sister who contacted the council to tell them that they had passed the exact same plans 3 years earlier, because they were the same plans of Billy Burns' house, which had been built. He was a Protestant guy. So how come there now was such an objection? And of course they were embarrassed in it, and they removed all the objections apart from like 3 minor things, that move a wall 4 inches or something, and the house was built.
Wow.
I never really knew that at the time. It was only later. So you're living through a moment that's happening to your own family, not knowing it. And then the other really intriguing thing was when we were building the house, I was just started secondary school, and I would come home in the afternoon and sort of assist the plasterers or the builders, and all these cars started to arrive. So I was about 13 at the time, 12 actually. Cars and minibuses started to arrive, because in the same field where we were building our house there was a small hall which was owned by the Ancient Order of Hibernians. There's an AOH, there's a big organisation in America, the AOH, generally fairly conservative and Catholic, but anyway, they had this hall and these people were going into it, and we were going out later, and I remember seeing these young people with long hair, and what I now know was somebody wearing an Afghan coat, but I didn't know what it was at the time. But it seemed interesting, and I remember thinking I'd love to get in to see what it was. And what it actually was the civil rights marchers coming from Belfast, and they had been stopped in Antrim by unionists out with pickaxe handles and everything. And the AOH, to their credit, facilitated them in cars and minibuses to come and stay overnight. in the hall as they were making their march to Derry, the long march to Derry.
Wow.
Which was finally attacked outside Derry, and people were just beaten by police and unionists, and the police were there with people who were masked and all. So it's interesting growing up through that time. And then we moved into our new house, and we had electricity, and then we had TV, and it was those early years. Then I started to watch a lot of the talks that would be on, and I know that I seen the photograph the other day of Bernadette Devlin, who was this very young woman. But who really epitomised the struggle at that time. Was involved in the old riots in Derry, where young people held off the police for 3 days. I mean young, like 12, 13, 14. They got onto the top of Rossville Flats with petrol bombs, and the police just couldn't come into the area, which is why eventually the British Army was brought in. So we started to listen to people like Bernadette, and I remember my father watching the TV, and the debates had been really animated and excited, even though that never transferred into any political activity on the outside. But what you realise later was that people like Bernadette were articulating what he experienced.
What he was feeling.
Yeah. So it was a real shift in consciousness, both then. And then I suppose I became more interested in that. Then some people who would have been a few years older than me in school were ended up in prison. So again, it was coming closer to you. And I suppose that, but the big turning point for me was there had been a special paramilitary police force. Well, they're all paramilitary police forces, but they had, apart from having the RUC, which was the police, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, they also had another organisation called the B Specials, which were basically part-time police, heavily armed, no rifles and all the rest of it, and basically it was a Protestant militia. Then there was such an outcry about them because it killed people that had been involved in burning down streets in Belfast and such like that. The British government rather stood down and all the rest of it, and they started a new organisation called the Ulster Defence Regiment, which basically in practice became the B Specials. And the Ulster Defence Regiment then was a regiment within the British Army. It was the largest regiment actually, predominantly Protestant. But it ended up with a lot of people. I was about 15 then, and a lot of people that I would have known in Randalstown in the town, Protestant guys who we played football with, suddenly were in this Ulster Defence Regiment, and we were getting stopped by them. And I vividly remember the first night getting stopped. I remember the guy and asking me for my name and where I was coming from and where I was going to, and he was embarrassed because
he knew you.
He knew you.
Oh my God!
But after the first time, the embarrassment went, and then it was just the aggression, and we had been stopped and held for several hours or taken to a police barracks for no reason. I mean, I wasn't involved in anything at the time, and neither was any of the mates who were with me. Were just coming from maybe a dance late at night or whatever. And I suppose it was then I realised, and I wouldn't have maybe formulated it in my mind at that time, but I realised that there were two communities, but it wasn't about what church you went to on a Sunday. It was about that one had the power to have weapons legally and be on the street and stop me and basically do whatever they wanted. And that would have been probably the turning point where I became more thinking about what I should do. It also been, we had begun up to dances, maybe singing rebel songs, Irish rebel songs that they'd heard, and then feeling very hypocritical that you're doing that. And so I was going through a period of transformation myself, thinking more about it and thinking I need to do something about this, and this is just hypocritical if I'm just singing about things. And so I made a decision that I would join the IRA when I was 16, and then it becomes difficult because you don't know the IRA. They didn't know the IRA in my area because they don't walk about saying we're the IRA,
right?
But I did end up one night talking to someone who I thought might be, who was actually a school pal, who I thought might have some sort of links. And anyway, a few months later I was approached, and this guy said to me, I hear you're interested in joining the IRA, and I said yes, and then I took my bit another, you couldn't join until you were 17. So very shortly after my 17th birthday I was enrolled in the IRA, and then became active in it immediately, which would have meant carrying out operations from bombings or shootings or whatever. As a result of that early activity, while I was still 17, I ended up on the run, which meant away from home because I was being sought after by the security forces. And that would have meant staying in other people's houses. We would call them safe houses, or sometimes going across the border and living in Monaghan and back and forward over. And but finally, just before my 20th birthday, I was captured at my own house. I went to it probably foolishly, and was there probably about 3 o'clock in the morning. At 6 o'clock, the police arrived.
Wow.
So I don't know what it was. And that man ended up in prison, was eventually sentenced to life imprisonment for IRA activities and membership. And it was a special year in 1976. I was arrested in August 1976. My 20th birthday was in September. But prior to 1976, prior to March the 1st, anybody arrested and imprisoned for political offences, so IRA or loyalist paramilitaries, you were recognised as what the British government calls special category prisoners, but really it was political status. So you wore your own clothes, you didn't do prison work, you were held in it was a special prison. It was a former RAF camp, Royal Air Force camp, so outside Lisburn. So it had all the Nissen huts, these special 6-ton huts. You would see in the Second World War. I mean, it just looks like a prisoner of war camp. Wire around it and watchtowers with British soldiers and all. But basically it was a prisoner of war camp, and it was because of that image going across the world that the British wanted to change it. At that time also you had internment without trial, so people from 1971, the British had introduced internment, so people could just be arrested and put in the jail without any definite charge. It was just on the basis of someone saying, "Oh, what I see in the Adrian, I believe she's an IRA." So tortured. There was the early ones tortured. It was a case taken to the European Court. In fact, it has been reviewed again because they now came across information that the British Home Secretary was aware of what was happening. A really significant thing, I suppose, in relation to the connection with America. The people who had been tortured, I mean, they were blindfolded, held in helicopters, told that they were several hundred feet up, and then they're pushed out of the helicopter. But they're really only a few feet off the ground. They were stripped and put into the white. Everything that's used in Guantanamo today started here. They were put into white overalls, made to stand spread eagle with their fingertips, and if they fell or they were pulled up again and such like, and white noise. So it was. It was torture. Went to the European Court because of, probably because Britain's involved in the European Court as well, but they weren't condemned for torture, but it was brutal and inhuman treatment, it was named for it. And that's what the American government has used later on about Guantanamo, so it's not torture. They go back to that ruling.
Wow.
So last year, the people who had been tortured retook their case, appealed it, because in the meantime information had become available. Actually Carrington, who was the British Home Secretary at the time, actually knew, and whether he instigated or whatever, but they knew that it was torture. They were going to use these specific measures anyway. So it's interesting how things in a very local place become used elsewhere. Anyhow, from the 1st of March what the British did at the end of 75 was to end internment, because they were now so embarrassed by it. Just looked bad that this country. I mean, I spoke to students in England and elsewhere, and with King's College, and you talk about you say to them, do you realise that at the end of the 20th century your country was actually interning people without trial? Like, this is something meant to happen in the Soviet Union or China, and they're oblivious to it. It was like for 4 years people were held in this democratic inverted commas. So it was part of a very comprehensive counterinsurgency policy devised by General Sir Frank Kitson, who had been in the Aden and Cyprus and everywhere. I mean, he was the Brits' counterinsurgency guy. So, and he is also, am I right in remembering that he is also the person who was responsible for running the operation in Derry, in which the massacre happened? And Ballymurphy and that there. I mean, I mean, you just see how every country, the same policy, which is basically, I mean, it's a very I've read his book, Low Intensity Operations. It's basically...
His book is called Low Intensity Operations?
Yeah. You use local forces rather than your own, so they use loyalist paramilitaries.
Yeah.
They basically were directed by British intelligence. You use the media, you get your people into the media, so the media thing is pumped out. You use the courts. And the courts were changed from, they set up what was called diplomat courts, so they removed juries. So now you only had one judge. But the judge should, for the comments, remind himself that he was a jury as well as a judge.
Wow.
They changed the powers of arrest, that you could be held for 7 days without access to a solicitor. They set up new interrogation centres. All specific. So I think what happened, the Brits were caught unawares in the early 70s. But once they started to see how things were rolling out and that the IRA hadn't been defeated, they devised this very elaborate policy. And one part of it, criminalisation, was about the prison. So now they're going to say that there was no such thing as political prisoners. There wasn't a political struggle going on here. It was just sectarian warfare. And it's really interesting that in that 76 there was a new radio station set up, which is still going today, Downtown Radio. And it did news broadcast every 15 minutes, which was very unusual at that time. And a whole new language was introduced. So it was about sectarian gangs, mafia-style shootouts. That language is never used.
Mafia-style shootouts?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
That was never used in 75. And I remember talking to a woman, it's been interviewed by a woman from BBC Radio 4 who came over from London. And she started to talk. And as we were talking, I was getting a bit annoyed by her language. And I says, do you ever, out of curiosity, just listen to your own broadcasts from 1975? Because you just actually talk about IRA active service units. That was just the way to do it. But a year later, you're talking about sectarian gangs and Godfathers, mafia-style shootouts and sectarian gangs. And to her credit, she went away. And she contacted me a few days later and she says, I'm amazed.
Yeah.
So it's about how you use language, words, you drop, and every 15 minutes it's getting pumped out. There's more and more. And so it just creates this image of whatever. But anyway, what I meant for the jail was that we would no longer be treated as political prisoners. They built a new part of the same prison called the H blocks. There's 8 of them. It was going to be single cells. You'd wear a prison uniform. You'd do prison work. You would be integrated with loyalists and ordinary prisoners. So the first person to be sentenced under the new regime was a guy called Kieran Nugent from Falls Road in Belfast, who had already been in prison as a schoolboy internee. He was still 15 or 16 when he was interned, and then he had been in prison for a man. So you're talking about the age of people. When I was 19, almost 20 going in, that was the average age. So anyway, Kieran was going to be sentenced. Looking back on it, it shows you just how ignorant you were about things. Because we thought this is just another silly policy that the Brits have come up with. Give it 6 months and it'll be done away with. So we're just not going to wear the prison clothes. That's it. I mean, simple as that. And let's get on with it. So Kieran was sentenced to 3 years for IRA membership. He was taken to the H blocks. They told to strip and put on the prison uniform. He refused to put it on and came up with this famous statement, "You'll have to nail it to my back." And badly beaten, put into a cell. And the only thing he had to clothe himself in was a blanket. And that became known as the blanket protest. It lasted 5 years. And it was joined at its height. There was probably about 450 of us on it. There was always about 350 some people left because they just couldn't take the brutality or the whatever else was happening, and family issues and such like. But basically, we run a protest which meant you're locked up 24/7. You didn't have radio or TV or books or magazines. It's easier to say what you had, which was a piece of sponge for a mattress. You had 3 blankets. You had a water gallon. You had the compulsory Bible, which we used to use the pages to roll up or make cigarettes out of. You weren't allowed to smoke. Everything had to be smuggled. You weren't allowed pens or papers. So for instance, all the writings of Bobby Sands, who was one of the prisoners who then died on hunger strike, is famous now for his writings and his poetry and his songs. But everything, he had to hide it inside his body.
Yeah.
The pens, the cigarette papers he'd write on, everything had to be smuggled out, smuggled in. And it's to the credit of the community on the outside, and particularly young women. who became the couriers to the prison, smuggling in the letters, smuggling them out, taking them to the IRA. I mean, there was occasionally, and the prison guards did their best to try to capture any of this stuff. It was hidden in all sorts of orifices in their body, from nose, mouth, the anus, everything. But and they did catch some of it, but there was like a river of communication flowing into the prison. Like Bobby Sands could write to the Army Council of the IRA in the morning, get an answer back in the afternoon. You know.
Wow.
It was just so.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah, it's about how people in that situation on the outside just. I suppose I didn't realise it the later years, you know, the impact of it, because you're living in the middle of it. It's almost like you're in the eye of the storm. But for people on the outside, I suppose they thought, well, if these people are doing this in jail, then we need to step up to the plate.
Yeah.
And yet, actually, some of the things they did was, I mean, because they were being beaten off the streets, plastic bullets were being fired. A number of people killed by plastic bullets by the police because they didn't want people on the street, because that became a visible sign of support.
Right.
We ended up, the protest intensified in March 1978. So it had been going on for almost 2 years by then, and I think the prison authorities were surprised that it had lasted that length of time, and then began what we believe was a concerted attempt to just literally beat us off the protest, denying us toilet facilities, etc., etc. So we ended up, without even planning for it, in what became known as the No Wash protest, although it's interesting, the British referred to it as a dirty protest. And there's a big difference between saying the No Wash.
The No Wash protest.
We were refusing to wash because we wanted proper washing facilities, we wanted wanted towels, we wanted proper access to washing and toilet facilities. They're denied, and within 3 days we ended up in what became known as the No Wash protest. And it lasted for 3 years, so I didn't wash from March 1978 up until the 2nd of March 1981.
You're kidding. Oh, wow.
So you have long hair and straggly beard, and again, thinking on it in later years, and this is the image your family see when they come up, and we got a visit once a month if you're prepared to wear the prison clothes. And initially we didn't, but then when the protest intensified and the No Wash, we decided it was a better tactic for communications to wear the prison clothes, to go out on the visit to tell people what's happening, basically.
Yeah.
You could smoke on the visits too, and like you can imagine someone coming up on the visit, thinking of it now, because we were like chain smoking on the visit.
Yeah.
And you're sitting there, and I mean, I'm tall, I'm 6'2", I'm about probably 13 stone now, but I end up at that time, even before the hunger strike, 10.5 stone, so you're thin, and you're sitting smoking it. Having used outside, and how's things going? You're saying, yeah, everything's sound, you know, and it's like,
yeah, right.
So like the impact on families, but then people came together. There was protests, there was marches, there was everything you think of to try to resolve the situation. And I suppose in Irish history, there's always been hunger strikes by Republicans over conditions, over recognition. Actually, political status had been won in the first place in 1972 after a hunger strike. So there's always this aim of doing it, but I suppose wiser heads had argued against it, because we knew at this time criminalisation was such a big plank in this overall strategy. Maggie Thatcher was in power at the time, and even in England, was destroying her own communities, the mining community and everything else, you know. So, but anyway, it came to a point where we just couldn't go on indefinitely on a protest like that. There was a hunger strike called at the end of 1980. 7 men joined it. At the one time, it went on for 53 days. There was all sorts of behind-the-scenes talks between the Brits and the IRA through a number of priests and other people who are now known. It's all documented now. But the hunger strike then ended when one of the prisoners was at a point of that he's going to die soon, and ended on the basis that there was a document that had already been produced, which could be enough to make a compromise. But because nothing was signed, sealed, delivered, agreed upon, and the hunger strike was over, Brits just reneged on everything. So we were sitting Christmas 1980 in the exact same position as we had been before the hunger strike ever began.
Right.
And I suppose probably then the Brits would have thought, well, we'll be, Maggie Thatcher talked about this playing the last card, and they probably thought that's totally demoralised and disillusioned and all. And there were people there, people who were shattered, people who left to protest. But there's also a lot of anger, and it was decided the hunger strike would start again. There'd be another hunger strike, and this time it would be more, strategically devised, so it wouldn't be a number of people all at once who then all would reach a critical point all at once. Bobby Sands, who was the OC, the officer commanding the prisoners at that time, he would start it on his own on the 1st of March, which was 5 years to the date that criminalisation was introduced. He would start it, there would be a gap of 2 weeks, Francis Hughes would start it, and then there'd be another gap of a week, and two other guys, Raymond McCrease and Patsy O'Hara, would join it, and there'd only be the four. And originally it was thought that there wouldn't be any replacements, but that changed later on, that if one person died, then someone else would join the hunger strike. And when Bobby joined it, and Bobby was a fantastic singer. He's become an icon now, and people all have their image on what it is, and they see his writings, which is great that the writings were there, but he just was a fantastic singer, and had the luxury of being in a wing with him for about 9 months. One time in 1979 they separated 32 of us from the protesting blocks, which were 3, 4 and 5, and they moved us to an isolation unit sort of thing. And Bobby was there, and he got up at nights and we'd be asked him to do a one-man concert, because he just
sang like that.
It's just no one would be standing there on a cold night, and the voice reverberates around the place, because anyway, he...
Did you know him before? Or you met him?
No, I just met him in prison, and then had that 9 months. He had been in prison before as a political prisoner, got released, was very much involved in the community work and development, community stuff, and then got rearrested again in 1977, or 1987, or 77, sorry. So Bobby began it, and we thought, well, he's going to definitely die, because this time the Brits will want the pound of flesh. They want to see someone dead before there be any movement. So there was a very low, and because it had been the hunger strike just a few months earlier, people outside were exhausted, there was very little media talk about it. But when Bobby joined it in the first, and it was his decision that we would end the No Wash protest the following day. So it would be then very clearly about our bigger demands, which was our own clothes, etc., rather than some confusion about, well, if we come off the protest, we would get clean cells and washing facilities. That no longer was the case. It was a good learning point for me, because I was really opposed to coming off. I was saying, Bobby's going to join hunger strike. The next day we come off and watch protests. It's like we're actually almost like sacrificing him or something, But it was a total wrong thinking. That he had the clarity, like, it's not about a no wash protest. That's now been superseded by the hunger strike. It's about our real demands. And then I often think that in the back of his head, did he have it that if the whole hunger strike failed, at least we were moved out of that situation. So it would be easier for the communists to move into some other type of thing. Anyway, by fluke, by accident, while he was on the hunger strike, there was a member of Parliament for Manor South Tyrone, which is a constituency in the north. He was a nationalist, elected to the House of Parliament in England. He was an independent nationalist and was always a supporter of our demands, and had visited the jail a number of times. He died. For some reason the British called a by-election very quickly to re-elect someone else, and the decision was made to put Bobby forward for election. Now at that time, and again it's a difference between hindsight, if Bobby won the election, but at the time we didn't know if that was a good idea or not, because if he lost, then Maggie Thatcher would say, well, your own people don't even support you.
Right.
At that time, Republicans didn't stand on elections. They actually boycotted parliaments in elections. So it was a total... and it was people like Gerry Adams now who thought it was a good idea. And to make it work, it would mean all the other nationalist candidates standing down and giving Bobby a free run at it.
Wow.
So any vote, if you're going to vote, you can only vote for Bobby if you're a nationalist. People weren't going to vote for the Unionist.
That's right.
And he ended up, he won it by over 30,000 votes, which is more than Maggie Thatcher got in her constituency. And we went from a point of, the start of his hunger strike that he's definitely going to die tonight suddenly. This is it, we won, you know. And again, it shows you
how far into the hunger strike?
It was about
when this happened?
Probably about 40 odd days. It was middle of April. I think it was about 20th of April. So it's maybe about 50 days or certainly late 40s. So he's still alive, obviously, and then within a few days after it, the only thing the British were doing was putting through emergency legislation that no prisoners could stand in for election. Whereas before that, you could be a prisoner and stand for election. Now they're afraid that someone else would stand, so so they're basically saying we're going to let him die, and none of the rest of us are going to be able to stand, and that's what they did. And and then we waited, and time just dragged out, and Bobby died after 66 days on the 5th of May. And then the deaths continued. Francis Hughes died a week later, and Rim McCrease and Patsy O'Hara a week after that. And then had a policy of people taking their place. Yeah. And then it came to a point, but it meant there was only 4 ever on it at one time. But then in the middle of June, we decided to increase the numbers on it. So over a number of weeks, someone would join it. I think it was about 6 over a period each Monday. So I ended up joining it on the 29th of June. Okay. By that time, 4 had died. And one died very shortly after it. Joe McDonnell. And I've continued on. And then again, there were attempts to try to resolve it just after I joined it. I was taken to the hospital for a meeting with this group called the Irish Commission for Justice and Peace, which was a probably well-meaning, totally naive group of people, like church and supported by the Dublin government, and people just looking some sort of, I suppose, easy way out. I mean, I've written about them. Like, there was only one had any integrity. He was a priest, and he happened to be a cousin of Francis Hughes, who had died on hunger strike. Okay. And he was also a cousin of another guy, Tom McElwee, who at that time was alive but died also. Mm-hmm. And that was for 2 days, and talked about how they had reached disagreement, and they had got the basis of our demands, and we were trying to say, the basis, what do you mean by the basis? Well, more or less, and we're saying, we've been on this protest for 5 years, poor people are already dead. Yeah. We want, in black and white, here's what's available. Right. And we couldn't get that, and went on for a whole day, and into the next day. And finally, at one point, and the dynamics of them changed. On the first day, certain people were talking who would have been, like that guy Oliver Crilley, who's the priest. The next day he was quiet, and it was more dominated by this guy who was a member of the SDLP, which was a Social Democratic Labour Party here, Nationalist Party, and became an MEP, I think, a member of the European Parliament. But anyway, at one point the next day after this, and people were exhausted. Yeah. On hunger strike, all we took was water and salt. You need salt for your brain and the electrical impulses and that there, but there was no...
Like you would have put the salt in the water and drink
it? Well, I did at the start, which was really terrible. So after that, dip wet your finger and dip it in salt and take it. It's easier to take the salt that way, rather than, because you put it in the water, it's like...
It's horrible. Yeah.
Yeah, it's horrible, Yeah. But anyway, after it was going on all the next day, and still this dragging out, and we had asked for, black and white, and we wanted Gerry Adams and Danny Morrison to come in and be our witnesses on it. They let Danny Morrison in on a private visit with us, but not Gerry, but still nothing. And as he said, when we met, there was still nothing. There's all this vagueness up there somewhere. And at one point then, Tom McElwee, who was sitting across from his cousin, who was a priest, said, so basically you're saying that we have the clothing and nothing else? And to his credit, Oliver Crilley said yes. And whenever he said that, and the guy facing me, who was a politician guy, I always thought this ironic, he thumped the table and says, it would be criminal to say that. So he's talking about his own colleague, and I thought it's just the word criminal when the whole thing was about criminalisation. Exactly. It just clueless. I don't know. Yeah. But I suppose the worrying for me around that time, the morning before, whenever we met for the first time, everybody was in it was a canteen in the prison hospital. And this guy there, Kieran Doherty, who became elected too as a TD in the South. But one person missing was this guy called Joe McDonald. And Joe was nicknamed Fat Joe, because even during the protests, for some reason, he was able to hold on to like some fat. And Joe was the oldest guy, and he died on it. But it's only been missing, and if I hadn't have known who was missing, I wouldn't have recognised the person that came in, because he came in a wheelchair. Wow. And he was just, it's just bones, and his head was rolled over the side, and his lips were hacked, and it was like saliva coming down.
Wow. But
whenever he spoke, you knew it was Joe, and he says, everybody here, and we all get a smoke, because you could smoke when you're on a hunger strike. Ironically, because you're in the hospital, you obviously can't work, so you're not refusing to work. You have to wear pyjamas, so you're not refusing to wear the uniform. So you're actually abiding by prison rules in some sense, So you're allowed to have radio, and you're allowed to see the TV, and it was always that was a good lesson of how, when you can see someone who is physically disabled, and somehow think they're mentally disabled,
right?
Or for me, I'm not there, and realizing no, they're not. They're just, it looks. Yeah. And the same with other situations, how it might look a particular way, but until you actually go deeper, you find out what the real thing is. Yeah. And Brandon McFarlane, who was the OC, that was our commanding prisoners, he was allowed to join us at the time, and
he became the OC.
He became after Bobby died. Yeah. Well, after Bobby went on the hunger strike, he then took over. As soon as Bobby joined the hunger strike, then he gave up being, which he had to do, and. And Joe says, Beck was Brendan's nickname, Beck McFarlane. He says, don't be accepting anything on my behalf. It's a 5 demands or nothing. We had 5 demands, which was the right to wear our own clothes, the right not to do prison work, free association, visits, and restoration of lost remission. He says, so don't be doing anything on my behalf. It's a 5 demands or nothing. I'll hang in here as long as I can, and it was really. And Joe died a couple of days later, and probably the other thing about Joe, when you see it at his funeral, he was, not to sound sexist or anything, but his wife Greta, who I know now, was a beautiful blonde-haired woman, he had 2 children, and Joe refused to wear the prison clothes to take visits, so he never seen his wife or his children until he was on a hunger strike, and then they could come and see him in the hospital. And the same with Rim McCreast, who died. I never wore the clothes, so you only get to see your family at a point when you're dying. And I suppose there's something just about you've seen Greta, the vibrancy of her as a woman. She would come up and visit another prisoner who was in the same wing as Joe. So Rim McCartney, who was on hunger strike as well, on the earlier hunger strike. So she would bring up and smuggle letters through Rim that Rim could give to Joe.
Wow.
So it's just, I suppose it's things you think of later, all those small, it's a small human things on it. The other guy who, I mentioned Tom McElwee, who died, his brother was also in the prison. And he had been asking for a visit repeatedly for his brother. Could he get a visit with his brother who's dying on hunger strike? And was constantly refused. And then he was granted the visit one day. So he's all excited. He's going to see his brother. He knows he's in a very critical state. Gets to the hospital to be told his brother's dead, but he identify him.
Oh my God.
And I was talking about it the other day, saying about how we often talk about policies, and the autonomous case policies were made. People make policies. Particular people sit down with particular names, and they sit around a table and they decide policies. So someone decided, no, you're not getting a visit. No, you're not getting a visit. and somewhere, and whether they do it out of cruelty, whether they do it out of unconsciousness or whatever else, but there's the ramifications of it and the consequences, and I suppose that has changed because in later years those are the things that I think about. Whereas at the time and shortly after it, you're very much hammering the whole political thing of your political prisoners. Our whole thinking was, if they can criminalise us, then they criminalise our whole struggle.
Yeah.
And it's not just now; it's all the whole past. And there was a song at the time, written and signed by a guy, Francie Brawley, if you can still hear it. It's called "I'll Wear No Convict's Uniform."
Yeah.
Nor meekly serve my time. And it sums it up saying that, we're not going that England might brand Ireland's fight 800 years of crime, and 10 years later, while I was still in the jail, we wrote a book, clandestinely wrote it in the jail, called "Nor Meekly Serve My Time," where we got accounts from I think it's about 28 people, myself included, just about that period in the history of it to recall it. And it was at a time when we were very much by then starting to write our history, because the hunger strike ended, 10 people died on it, I survived, I was on it 70 days. The reason it ended was really because our families started to intervene.
And your family intervened, right?
Intervened, yeah. There had already been about 3 or 4. What had happened was, our families weren't IRA volunteers or INLA volunteers, they were just families. And most of the families wouldn't have been politicised, because republicanism wasn't a big popular thing in the 50s or the 60s. Right. Our parents ended up being radicalised probably by us. Yeah. Like my mother would have been speaking on some platform, my mother would never, she was, don't mean to interrupt, a housewife, she reared family. That was, in Ireland at that time, women didn't generally work. And then in later years she worked in the canteen in the local school, where I was giving out meals. So someone who would never see herself in front of a TV camera or whatever else, would never imagine smuggling things in the jail, and they should be smuggling in tobacco, or notes.
Wow. And
you think afterwards, how that ordeal was when we're coming through searches, because it's totally alien to you, Yes. We're young, we're in the IRA and we're doing these things we expected, but for others it's different. So I had radicalised that element, but they were seeing one person dying after another. They came under pressure also from Catholic Church, ironically from a priest who had been supportive of us. And what was been said to them was, look, whenever we lost consciousness, that they should intervene. Now, some people wouldn't have had the opportunity to intervene because some people died instantly, like a heart attack.
Yeah.
Other people drifted into a coma, and
that's what happened with you, right? You drifted into a coma.
That's happened, yeah. And what happens legally is that what's called power of attorney shifts to your next of kin.
Yeah.
And they can authorise, so they're putting the spot.
Yeah.
Are you going to let your relative die, or are you going to intervene?
Yeah.
Which is what they did, and I regained. That was on Sunday morning. My family were allowed in after 68 days. Families were usually allowed in at the very last stages.
Yeah.
And I remember them coming in, I was lucid then. I don't remember the 69th day, but apparently I was still responding. But I was speaking to people, and it was different people, but I was responding. And on the 70th day, they check you, do all the reflexes and all, and then the doctor pronounces that you're in a deep state of unconsciousness and you're not going to come round again.
Yeah.
So I regained consciousness in the main hospital here in Belfast, the intensive care unit, and again thinking about it later years, so it was a voice I was hearing first, and it was my name, and obviously they must have seen I was starting to respond. What happens is they had these 2 massive drips.
Okay.
Back, one's just glucose and the other was whatever else, so that whenever they authorise intervention, they immediately give you 2 large syringe injections into both legs, which apparently can kill you as well, because it floods your body with glucose and whatever else to keep. And then they strapped on these. I don't know if that happened in the hospital or in the ambulance. But anyway, it was a voice saying, "Lauren, you're in the intensive care unit at the Royal Victoria, and you're blind by this stage." And you couldn't see.
Yeah.
I was by then 7.5 stone,
Wow.
which is, you use pounds and stone or kilograms.
We
so
say pounds in the US.
Yeah, well, 7 stones is 7 stone is what 98 pounds.
Yeah.
So about
Oh,
104 pounds or something. So you're only born.
For someone 6'2", yeah.
Yeah, and again, what struck me afterwards, it was, first of all, you were called by your first name,
Yeah.
and it was a woman's hand on the shoulder. It's like, Laurence, we're turning you over now, okay? And then we're being very gentle. Yeah, so hearing your voice, hearing a woman's voice in that situation. And a really funny incident, I mean, it shows you in bizarre situations. I says, look, I have to go to the toilet, I have to urinate, that's okay, Laurence, so they had to get the bedpan type thing or whatever else, and did what I had to do, and then about 15 minutes later, it was funny, so I remember saying, like, you're aware that you're alive. People asked, were you happy to be alive? I said, look, I was neither happy to be alive nor sad to be alive. I was just, if you think of a point of exhaustion, and then multiply it 100 times, I was just aware that I was. Mm-hmm. It's a bizarre thing, and the only connection was just this person who was the nurse beside me. I wasn't thinking, well, what I'm going to do tomorrow or next day or anything. It's just, you've used every physical, psychological, emotional energy just to try to live as long as possible, and then thinking I'm gone and I'm not gone. But about 15-20 minutes later, God, I need to go to the toilet again. But now I'm embarrassed to say it again because I've just done it. So, like, you're in a situation and it's like a stupid sort of and I said, look, I'm sorry about this, because you're as if you're putting them out of their way, you know. I said, look, I'm sorry, I need to go to it. And I remember I laughed. She says, Laurence, there's 2 bags of liquids going through you. See if you didn't have to go to the toilet, we'd be concerned, you know. And it's just funny how in the middle of something that's in this world, there's this sort of, and it's a human interaction and a bodily function. And then after that, I was taken to they used to have a military or secure unit at a different hospital where you go if you're a prisoner, and there was 3 other guys there who had been on the hunger strike who were now off it as well. And then about just less than 3 weeks later, I was taken back to the prison hospital, and they were now taking us back quicker. Before that, some of the people who had come back, I was still blind. I was still very thin.
You were still blind when you went back to the prison?
Yeah, because I ended up with a permanent damage, nystagmus, where your eyes twitch, but at that time, like, they're really going, and it's not the eye itself; it's the brain cell is broken down at the optic nerve that then causes it. And actually, what they say is that women who are pregnant and give birth and they're malnourished often give birth to babies that have nystagmus or something between lack of nutrition and this. By the time it going rapidly, you'd be sitting there looking at me and you would see the eyes going. So then it becomes, you're unsteady and lights annoy you and everything. But I'd worked on it for years to get that point where I could just, it is a bit relaxing. Your eye, and not trying to force. You could twist your eye in a particular way that it does stabilise, but then that's only distorting. Anyway, they took me back and they said, about going to the prison hospital. I said, no, there's no way, because the hunger strike is still on. Yeah. So there's people there who are. Yeah. And all they says, well, look, we'll have to take you there when we arrive, and then we'll take you down to the block. And I never known was it just very deliberate or not. But when I arrived back to the jail, was taken to the prison hospital, and walked right down to the last cell. Yeah. So you can hear people. And you know the sounds, because there's people actually been sick at times and throwing up. A lot of people couldn't. You needed to keep water down during the hunger strike, because if you don't, your kidneys are under massive pressure because you're cannibalising yourself, and toxins and all are there. So you need to keep drinking water to try to flush that out. Yeah. And a lot of people ended up. It comes to a point where it's very difficult to drink water, because as your sight goes, sense of smell really intensifies. So you smell water. And somewhat amazing, like the smells of it. At the end of the day, they were flying us in water from Scotland somewhere, like bottled water, mineral water, because we just couldn't drink the stuff in the tap and the smell of it.
Wow.
Things like floor polish really annoy you. I remember one day this prison guard who was okay, and he brought in this jug of water with these things in it, and the only thing I smelt was Old Spice aftershave.
Wow.
And I was going, what's that? And he told me what I was talking about, and I explained to him. And the only thing he could put it down to was 3 days earlier he had been out at night and he'd shaved and put on aftershave. But it was 3 days ago and he'd washed and showered and all since then, but I could just smell the reeks of it. Yeah. Anyway, so I was taken back in, walked down and that was an experience, because you're back in a place that I was like 3 weeks earlier. You know what people are going through. You can hear the sort of sound. You can hear some of the families with people. And then when it came 2 o'clock, I was taken back to the block, and that was when I was put back in the cell. The door closed. And it was the first time in jail I felt really claustrophobic. Yeah. I never felt when I went into jail originally. I don't know where it was. I'd been out in the hospital where you're in a bigger ward. It was okay. It was still a security ward, but there was 4 beds, so it was a biggish one. And then the hunger strike ended about 3 or 4 days later, and we got the right to wear our own clothes, and for us it was the most important, but 5 demands, but it was the most important one. On one level, because we said we'd never wear the prison clothes, and that stigma of it, we didn't, but on a more practical level, it allowed us to get out of our cells for the first time in 5 years, because we had our clothes on. We'd go to the canteen, get our meals, we'd go to the exercise yard, and then we could start to organise and strategise where do we go from here. And there's a lot of sorrow at the time. People who would, they've been friends or part of our life for 5 years. But there was anger and determination that we would get the outstanding demands, and we would use whatever means necessary, bar none, to get them. But it was a real soul searching moment for us too, because we knew we were going to have to rethink what we were doing. Involving up down now, like 1981 for us was, I call it the end of rebellion and the beginning of revolution, because I suppose the Irish have always said something, they're called as rebels, but it's okay saying, bring it on, we'll take whatever you throw at us and we'll throw it back at you, but that's not good enough. You need to strategize where are we going and not be deflected by some of the deliberate things that they do. Mm-hmm. We knew there's never going to be another physical protest in the jail that will supersede what's just happened over the last 5 years, 10 people dying and 5 years of intense protest. And the big lesson, we should never again allow ourselves to be locked behind doors because of our own sort of ideas of principles or something. We need to be out, and it was a great thing about I have a big tattoo on my back, and I have a willow tree, which is about how we need to bend and be flexible and bounce back up again. Because every time, the stronger the wind, the deeper the roots go. But if you're inflexible, then you're easily crushed. You just snap. Whereas if you can bend in it and come up, and but it was, we stayed on it, and we still refused to work. So we're still more or less on a protest, but now at our clothes we could get out, we could still get visits, but we could only get half of what we were entitled to. We knew we couldn't maintain that forever. A lot of people also left the protest, new people coming into jail weren't allowed to join us. So we knew that couldn't go on, and what we agreed on a day was that we would go into the system. We would say we're prepared to do prison work, but we would do it with the intention to, we wouldn't work. We would say we're working. We'd always agreed we would, in our own wings, we would give out food, we'd clean the wings and all the rest of it. That's not work, that's just keeping your environment properly. But the workshops, like they took people down to make uniforms or make chairs or furniture, we wouldn't do that, we'd just sabotage the workshops and had planned that on a specific date we would just burn the workshop to the ground. Excellent. Was the plan. So we will say we're going to work, but we'll not work, but getting to that point, and again a big lesson to me, because it's the heart versus the head. The head saying, yep, this is what we need to do, and the heart saying, so we're going to do now what 10 people died saying they want to do prison work, and now we're going to do prison work.
Right.
in your head saying, yeah, but we're doing it so that
we
actually win that authentic getting it back. And I remember the day when we agreed to come off, and we did a lot of other elaborate stuff. We sent off what was specific people into the other blocks who were conforming to start to agitate there and provoke the loyalists into going on a protest. So they'd be in protest and we wouldn't be. Because for years we had been on the protest and losing everything, and they reaped the benefits because anything we got, they got. So we deliberately orchestrated a lot of things there, and it worked really. I mean, that was very dangerous time. I mean, there was weapons caught in the jail. There's fire bombs and all that the IRA was setting. There's beatings. It was a very tense period, and it was interesting again. Something about becoming conscious of yourself. What really worked in our favour was the image, probably now the loyalists out of us, of these just maniacs. They've been on a protest for 5 years, no wash protest, and they'll do anything. So you really had that sort of, they'll do whatever.
Yeah.
So you better lock up and do whatever you need to do because. So it worked. I'm not even realising that later on because it's always been an interesting thing to then realise how others perceive you rather than how you perceive them. Anyway, but I remember the governor coming to me and saying, so every 2 weeks you were asked, you prepared to abide by prison rules, do prison work? And I said, yes. And your man looked at me, with a big smile on his face. So, McKeown, you're going to do prison work? And he knew what he was saying, and I knew what he was saying, after our comrades down. And I says, yes. They'd asked me that twice, and I was sticking in my throat to say yes,
Yeah.
And then with a big smile on his face because he was thinking, we'll have them, and slammed the door over again. But what I meant was, we ended up, we all come on a particular date, come off the protest, and all Republicans were together. And it was a whole new environment, and there's a whole pile of stories there that were great, but there was this whole energy, and what again showed was how a jail can, and any prison functions with the cooperation of the prisoners,
right,
to a certain degree. They have to some sort of arrangement, otherwise it'll just be total coercion and whatever else. American jails are brutal, but so they had their rules here. We're going to take these prisoners out to go to the workshop and all the rest of it. But if you're dealing with a group of people who are totally disciplined, so in the morning, for instance, you're meant to be out in the circle area of the block at, say, 8 o'clock to go to the workshop. So everybody has to be there. So what you have to do is get somebody to take their time. So you plan it right, Autumn, you hold back for 2 minutes. You're going to the toilet. Where's, first Autumn Brown, coming now. Then, okay, get you out, still waiting. Somebody else has to come. Someone goes out and then remembers something, they have to go back. So you ended up with this group of prisoners standing in the middle of the circle. The system can't work because you're not abiding as the prisoner's totally conforming. It's going to be there at 8 o'clock and everybody's going to be there, and the jail will work smoothly and they get them all there and then they'll go to the workshop. Whereas now it might be 8:30, 8:45 before you could even get this group of people out. And the whole attitude was, just by the administration, we'll just try to get them out there somewhere already. So they were taking people to the metal fabrication workshop and make chairs. So what the guys did was just set I was working as an orderly in the block. They just set the machine to make the chair with 4 different lengths of legs. So it's a useless chair. Or as one guy did, there were some expensive machines, open it up where the oil goes in, pour in sand, close it up again and switch it on full blast. The whole machine just burned out, But the other thing that obviously the IRA is still behind the scenes on this, and what they were now doing was using, because people were taken out of the jail, it's the first time you could see the whole layout of the jail exactly. You could see it in the past, a wee bit in the past. You seen it, you could observe how you open the gates. What the attitude is.
Tracking all this data.
All the knowledge is all going back into the central thing for an escape committee. And this guy who used to be on the wing with me, Larry Marley, who had already escaped in the 70s, come up with this idea, because all the people, of course, now protests over, now out, people were thinking of individual escapes and could you get over the fence, and there's all sorts of fences and walls and everything else. But Larry was, and I always thought this was amazing, he was thinking on a mass scale, and he was, how could we take out a large group of people out of here?
Yeah.
And I often thought that was the most audacious thing about it, that in those circumstances he could think way outside of the box. And what we planned to do was that we would get the food lorry that drove in each of the blocks, that they would take it over and literally drive out the front gate. And that's what happened. In 1973, so it's less than 2 years after the hunger strike. One of the blocks, H7, where they'd been able to lull the guards into a false sense. So they deliberately did it. So rather than like all the animosity which was in the blocks, in this block, because there was a few people who had their heads screwed on that thing about thinking outside the box, they started to become friendly, which caused a lot of dissent in other blocks, because we're hearing guys making tea for prison guards in H7. Fuck that. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, it's like that sort of, I'm starting to say about comrades, like what's happening? Like, what's the crack? And then the more confusing thing was there's a few other people there who you knew, like Bobby Story, who'd come on from outside, who the Brits were always trying to get into jail. He now was sentenced. He was in charge of the escape on the day. You're thinking, like, he's here, but what it was, they were lulling them into false sense of security. They got weapons smuggled in, and on a Sunday afternoon at a designated time, and it had to be in such a synchronized movement because there's something like 28 alarm points. So the prison guards in the different wings in the block had to be taken immediately at one time. And what you had was these number of guys in the circle, the main part, and they'd already broken down the screws that, you just say, open let me down to such and such a wing, or have to take the cleaning machine down, the bumper it's called. And there was a code shouted in the wing, anyone, will you stand out the bumper? And it was Bobby Story shouted this, and that was the signal that in each of the wings
to do there.
They took the guards, but also took the guards. They had to get from there. These other gates had to be open to take. There's two wings, so like it was a very complex thing, and a one-on field. Anyway, they took it, and they were in charge of the block. They arrested all the prison guards, and what I've often said to people afterwards, I mean, so many other different stories of it. There was a number of prison guards there who were amongst the most brutal during the protest period, and none of them were touched. And I've often said they just could have been put against the wall and executed.
Yeah.
No one would ever been made held accountable because nobody would have known who did it.
Yes.
Unless someone confessed to it.
That's right.
None of them were touched. They were tied up, their uniforms were taken, the van lorry came. It ended up that one of the guards in the emergency control room was told there was a guy holding a gun on him, and he was told not to move, just told us to step back from because the main, that would alert the whole jail. And the guy did move till to hit the alarm, and he was shot in the head with small caliber guns. He wasn't seriously injured as he was back in work a couple of weeks later, but then they took him, they released one of the medical guards, brought him out to give him medical aid and all the rest of it, which slowed up the escape. The lorry came in, they took charge of the lorry, put 38 prisoners on it, drove down to the front gate. The plan was that there'd be a press conference in Dublin. That was very to get down to the front gate, but because it's been slowed up, it's now at a time where a new batch of guards is coming on and another batch is going off, so there's a lot of guards at the one place at the one time. And whilst the IRA, the prisoners were able to take some of the guards and hold them at gunpoint to get the gate opened, a number of others seen that, but they're confused because these guys are wearing uniforms. But then some spotted what was happening, and there was a whole melee, and basically they weren't able to drive out. They had to just jump out of the lorry and run.
Oh wow! And
ran across barbed wire fields, and some of them got caught immediately. Some got caught after a couple of days, but 19 of them got totally away. And never did.
Wow!
And they're really interesting. I mean, there's a whole pile of other stories, and I mean, it wasn't just an escape. It was. Yeah. I've often said it was like probably the IRA's biggest operation in the whole time, because South Armagh, which is where you're at with Slieve Gullion, had a really strong IRA unit. They're on the border. Very few of them ever captured. Shot down helicopters and everything. Very, very strategic, and they're thinking that, and accepted by the British Army. They'll say that like this. They were up against a very formidable foe, but they knew their own area. The British Army only came in helicopters. They didn't do foot patrols. So basically, on the ground, the IRA controlled the area on the ground, radios, all the rest of it. Anyhow, because the escape was happening, they got a lorry. built specially with 3 layers of armour plating on it. The wheels were solid wheels, so they couldn't be shot out.
Yeah.
Solid rubber. Meant it slowed the whole lorry down. They had a roof on it that could slide back, and they had 3 anti-aircraft guns mounted in the back of it, and they drove right up to almost at the jail. Wee small village, which is a very Protestant Unionist village, called Scarva. And the guy who was in charge of it, he was killed later, Brendan Moley and Brendan Burns, both of them were killed in an explosion. So they drove up, and the whole plan was the lorry will come out of the prison and drive down, and even if the alarm goes up, this armour plated lorry will get behind it. So anything coming, Land Rovers or helicopters, they're gonna take them out.
Wow.
And like, I've been a long distance to the border, but so like the level of operation into it, and it ended up, it didn't happen that way. Guys ran, they had to hijack cars, take over houses, etc., etc. But I was talking to one of the guys who was in the lorry, and so it came a point, they waited half an hour longer than they want. They were already here on the radios because they were tuned into the police for waves thing, so they're hearing a message, so they knew the alarm has gone up, something's gone wrong.
Yeah. And
they're driving back, and he says, we're just sitting there saying, hopefully, for fuck's sake, come. They were so geared up to attack. They were looking for something.
Helicopter?
Yeah, where's the helicopter we could use this year,
Yeah.
And they made their way back, and then a number of the escapees, including Brendan McFarlane, who had been the OC, and our guy, they group and made it on foot over the hedges and fields over 3 days, walking at night and staying hidden during the day, and they made it right down to South Armagh.
Wow.
And then they actually met up with the first guys they met was
amazing.
the ones who had been on the lorry. But anyway, it meant that after that, prior to the escape, we were like, the prison rules were, it was compulsory to do prison work. It now changed to you're not allowed to do prison work. That was an end of all the workshops that we had there. Wow. But the other interesting thing about that night, I wrote a chapter in a book about this, called it the 25th of September. So the escapees have left the block.
Yeah.
So anybody left are people who aren't on the escape, people who are doing a shorter period of sentence or whatever else. The RUC came in, the British Army came in to search the place and searched everybody to see if there's any weapons about. And they were happy that there wasn't. Prison guards came in, and they moved the people from that block over to another block, and they beat every one of them going across.
Yeah.
And they had dogs and made them run a gauntlet. And actually one person tried to intervene and said that's not right, and the governor was there, and he had a gun in his hand. He said, you haven't got the stomach for it, take yourself off the fuck. And they're all awarded, they took a court case later, and they're all awarded damages because it was so I mean, they made sure they were denied medical treatment for about 3 days, but then a day they got it, and all the bite marks and all were still there, and, and bruise marks, and
wow.
And so anyway, so that was. Wow. Then the jail changed, and we got into. Now we had the conditions we wanted. We weren't in protest. We had our own clothes. You didn't have to do prison work, and now we could start to focus on what we'd always wanted to do, which was develop our own training camp. Basically, I mean, it's always ironic that the Brits wanted it. The H blocks was meant to be the breakers' yard. I think Maggie Thatcher actually said that term, and to me it became the most vibrant, creative training camp that I ever had, because we're now together one place and we could focus on education, and then in later years developed it. I'd been very much involved in it, and then became in charge of it and on the camp staff, and then introduced more like creative writing. We started our own magazine, which was again done clandestinely at the start. It was produced entirely by prisoners. Contributions were from prisoners in any of the jails, including America, Europe, England. So they would send the stuff, and guy I worked with, Brian, he was appointed the first editor. Later years, the magazine was allowed to come into the jail.
Wow.
And we could do it officially and all the rest, just as things changed. But the idea of doing the magazine, and the other things we did was to say, like, it would be our voice. It was called The Captive Voice.
The Captive Voice.
On Glór Gofa, which is Irish for it. On Glór Gofa stroke Captive Voice. And in the first editorial was then it was, I looked about how, how things are maintained not just by military force but by media, church, state, schools, all the rest of it. And so we need to struggle against all of those, and this captive voice would be our voice. And we still have copies. And the idea was to use short stories and I mean the short stories or as political analysis or as artwork or as whatever else. But it was to raise issues, and it's interesting how, well, on the second issue I wrote a book or a short story because one of the issues which I was talking earlier on there about Joe and Greta Joe who died in the hunger strike, but there's always an issue about, okay, it's mostly men who are in the prison, but I should have said earlier about women in the prison and on the same protest as well and on the hunger strike. Lesser number, but there. But one of the big issues always come up is about, well, how does people maintain relationships on the outside? And a lot of men in jail, probably for the first time, they're now very vulnerable, like their wife or their partner's outside. So is the relationship going to continue? Is it going to whatever? Is she going to end up, big fear, end up with someone else? So what some people always did was then end the relationship, which is a way of self-protecting, looking towards the end of it now, so when it happens it's and others maintain it, and thankfully a lot of relationships continue. But I suppose because of what we're part of our education into feminism and all the rest of it and trying to explore ourselves, and I ended up in a relationship then with someone outside, so you're posing, well, can you have some form of, because people laugh at it, prison relationship, like, it's silly or whatever else, but then you say, well, do you deny yourself some sort of engagement with someone on the outside just because you're in jail and you're doing life, you're not getting out. But then what's the implications of that there, like this, does some new guy ride on the blocks and go, yeah, I've been with, who's maybe less politically aware by now, and a bit more like, it was like, with so-and-so on the outside, and maybe that's the person who's you're the partner with, Anyway, so I wrote a short story which was about someone. It's called The Visit. It was made into a short film years afterwards, but it was a woman coming up and visit. And the idea was to raise the issue, because it's not talked about, it's sort of below the surface, but taboo. But it was a woman coming up on the visit, and you don't know until the moment she's about to walk into it that you realise she's pregnant. And it was always amazing, and then the story just ends, So the number of people I would have met afterwards, go down to the visits, because you're in a visiting room, there's other people going about, and everything's fairly relaxed by then, and women come over. So what happened? Did you tell him? How did he respond? I went.
The end of the story.
So the idea was to start to broaden out from more. An article was with gay prisoners. I did an article. Again, it was the first time it come up, and it's almost like, well, Republicans aren't gay. Like we don't have any gay IRA prisoners, It's all with it. And a couple of years ago, when the South did the same-sex marriage referendum, it was interesting. Sinn Féin resurrected the article we had done way back in 81. It was like 25. Like we were ahead of the policy by 25 years, Yeah. So it was I suppose I went way beyond what you're looking for there.
No, this is amazing. And you became a poet while you were inside. I mean, I feel like you were saying that this is really where your journey as a poet, as a writer began. Yeah,
I say I had that very intense political education program based on writings of Paulo Freire, Pedagogy of the Press. I remember getting, originally after the hunger strike, we weren't allowed any books other than novels. But what our families would do on the outside is take the cover off novels, take the cover off non-fiction books, and put the covers on. So it comes into the prison guard, looks at it and goes, it's some
romance novel.
Some romance novel,
That's
and I remember there was a friend of mine got
strategy.
Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and he had been on hunger strike too, Jackie McMullen. It was really a small book. I remember reading it, and it took me a couple of times to read it to totally take in what was there, but thinking, wow, that's amazing. But then the next thought was, but it wouldn't work here. And then the other thought was, well, why would it not work here? Well, because I think we're like an army, and we need some sort of structures and all the rest of it, whereas it's very sort of, teachers to pupil, and pupils to teacher, and all the rest of it. But the good thing was that, and I've often said this, like I haven't got a GLA, I also did a doctorate and whatever else, but it was more to write a book rather than get an academic qualification. Right. But during the period of, so I've said like I've done loads of education in the jail, outside the jail, but the actual 5-year period of protest was the most educational in my life, because it was unlearning all the crap in my head.
Right.
You suddenly realise I have this opinion about this, but what's it here? I'm maybe a bit, racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever else, but just just a model of things. So you may be okay in one subject, and then another you're sort of uneasy, and maybe that's not really right, but there's no coherent thing. Like you end up realising, it's just these thoughts that I have never ever sat down to sort of, I wouldn't even called it this at the time, reflect upon and say, well, so how do I see black people? How do I see people who are homosexual? And you're talking about 1976, so it's got back quite a few years. You've been reared Catholic and rural, and there's sort of level of understanding, sexuality or other things, or communism or whatever else. It's so it was, but that question sort of then came up, like why, or you were now suspect of anything you'd ever been sort of told, So thankfully there was that desire to question things. So whenever I read Paul Ferrari's, and part of me was saying, but it wouldn't work here, at least there was another part saying, well, why would it not? Mm-hmm. And that's what we ended up developing in the jail, largely, that approach. But the real, I suppose, was a moral pressure for people to get involved, but not to the point where, it's compulsory. Education wasn't compulsory. Getting away from lectures about things to more about talking about things. Yeah. And then it was almost by accident. We ended up with, around about 87, 88, we got another guy, again, we happened to be on hunger strike. He was writing to a woman in Sheffield in England, and she was in a poetry workshop, and she sent him a wee small basic pamphlet, a few pages stapled together of exercises that they were doing, and we started more as pastime and winter night to can't go out to the yard or the slot, whatever else, and it just unleashed the sort of creativity around the place, and people were really into it, and then we did myself and Brian who became the editor of the Cabinet Voice, actually typed up. We were at that time allowed typewriters. Everybody else was to run them out because of getting computers and outside. So the jail was getting typewriters. Wow. We didn't have them before. So we typed it up, and again, the really important thing, because our attitude was, if you get something handwritten, it's maybe okay, but if you actually type it, it looks different. Yeah. You put a cover on it, colour cover, whatever else, suddenly takes on significance. Now, the words are the exact same.
Yes, no, but it makes a huge difference.
Huge difference was just the appearance. So it became, that's what we typed it up, sent it around the block, did so many copies. And then that really encouraged others, and it was out of that, then we started the magazine. So then I wrote to a company in Galway, who are now publishing the book I just did before Christmas. It's called Salmon Poetry. They just set up a few years earlier. We're just saying, let's see what someone outside thinks about our poetry. Yeah. So wrote out and put some of this to the woman who was in charge of it, Jessie Landemi, who's still in charge of it, and she put me in touch with this poet who was just emerging at that time, Rita Ann Higgins. Mm-hmm. It was a woman who ended up in hospital for about a year with tuberculosis. Uh-huh. She was semi-literate when she was in the hospital, and because people brought her in books and that there, she actually started to become literate, and she took a real liking for poetry and got out and started writing poetry, and writes this amazing, it's a really working class, I don't say that in a derogatory way, but the issues that people on the ground are facing, her, she just has a great way of getting words against the administration, against oppressive regimes of whatever nature, just a really insightful look, and just published a lot of books since then. So that was like the start of encouraging. They published some of our poetry on the outside, which I think then encouraged us to continue writing, and then it was only in recent years I decided, because I still continued outside, but I didn't see myself as writing as a poet as such, but it was something that I like to do at times. Certain things happened that I like to, since almost document it that way. So I set her off the collection, and thankfully it was published just before Christmas.
And this is the collection, Threads.
Collection called Threads, yeah, and half of them are in the jail and half of them outside. And part of Threads, because at the same time as I was doing that, I started a project a couple of years ago in 2016, because that was like the 40th anniversary of the whole prison protest beginning in 1976. And I want to do something artistically about it rather than just writing something about it. And in the meantime, I had got an original blanket from the jail. Once the jail closed, released all the prison. There was ones going in who were doing wasn't construction work, but actually removing a lot of stuff. And anyway, they took a blanket, they got a blanket and they came and said, I don't know, you might want this, and he gave me an original blanket from the jail.
Jesus.
So I'd always had it in my my attic, like what do you do with a blanket? And then I thought what I wanted to do was to, or what I did was give it to a dressmaker and asked her to make certain clothes for me, like a waistcoat and scarf and a bow tie, and particularly a bow tie because it strikes you very formal, and and to take a jacket that I had and do the lapels with part of this blanket and pockets not there. And then I would photograph people who had been on the protest and been on a hunger strike, including the women in Armagh prison, and some of the women on the outside who had protested. Armagh, because women protested on the outside, mothers and all the rest of it, wearing only a blanket, like they didn't wear clothes on it, they wore only a blanket. So that
outside
was totally
protesting?
authentic. Yeah.
Wow.
There's a woman, particularly Mary Nealis, her two sons were on the blanket, and in 1970, shortly after the protest had started, there was this whole, again, go back to the media, there was a whole drive around what was called the Peace People.
Okay.
There's no politics, just wanted peace. It doesn't matter about the issues. They were invited down to Derry to the cathedral in Derry, where you were down. Invited by the bishop, who was a friend of Mary's. And Mary would have been more at that time a nationalist rather than Republican. And she was outraged that these people were invited, but what about her sons in jail? So she went down for the moment, wrapped in a blanket, stood outside the cathedral with an young woman whose husband was next door to me at that time in the jail, and she was just married, she was 18, Kathleen McKeown, and they stood with blankets, and I interviewed Mary last year for a project, and said, we only had the blankets, we had nothing else because we wanted to be like the men in the jail. And she was saying about parishioners coming out and poking her with umbrellas and all, outraged.
Oh, wow.
How dare she embarrass the bishop? Her own mother didn't speak to her, she says, for about 3 weeks.
Wow.
And she fell out with the bishop who was the bishop in Derry at Bloody Sunday. You see him holding the white.
Oh, wow.
Eddie Daly. We did a lot of other good work, but they never spoke after them. And there was a photograph taken, thankfully, at that time, which has become an iconic photograph of Marino. And then they're talking, and she tells you, and the funny things, they're away around the country doing the various talks, and a lot of times they'd be doing talks outside Mass on a Sunday. And she says, so we're up in this truck, like an ordinary lorry, just on up to do the talking. And she said, you're there and you're talking and you're holding the blanket around you and all the rest of it. And they'd finished talking and there's a crowd around and they're clapping on. And then she says, we'll have to get down off the top of the lorry. And she says, it's pretty difficult, you've blankets all around you to get out.
Right.
So, she says, one side, come on ahead, I'll give you a lift. And she said, there's this woman in front of her. Mary is a great community worker, and she was a Sinn Féin activist for years and elected representative. And she said, forget who the woman was, Margaret or something, goes a step forward, and as she's trying to step down to someone, the woman behind has a foot on the blanket. She says, woman gets down, the blanket comes off, and I says, there's obviously this big farmer from Mayo who thought, I've died and gone to heaven, because he had said there, jump on down, I'll get you here.
Oh my God.
So it's funny how people, in the midst of all of that, there have the crack about it. So it was, I don't know how I got on that there, but so the idea was to subvert the image of that period, which is all about long hair and beards and shit on the walls and all the rest of it. Now it was people who are happy to say, we wore the blanket. We don't walk about today with a blanket on us, but we would walk in, and there was at the time I was doing it, there was this project in Ireland called National Treasures, which was organised by RTE, which is the National Radio and Television Station in the South. They were doing it in conjunction with the National Museum of Ireland. So what they wanted to do was to go around to different parts, Belfast, Dublin, Cork and Galway, and ask people to bring in items that are some sort of historical or social significance that would become part of this National Treasures. And Paula McFettridge, who's the artistic director I work with at the Boys Theatre, she says, when you take in your items on it, I was sort of half an hour. Anyway, so I went down to the Titanic Quarter, which is where they're having it here in Belfast, this big thing about Titanic ship and all that. But it's a big visitor centre, and this is where they're having it. And it's so I walked in wearing it, and I had the waistcoat on and the bow tie and all that. So I thought I was wearing the scarf, and I walked in, and it was amazing because they were all over it then, and the RT wanted to film it. They'd already heard about this project of what was going on. But what was really moving for me, because I said I made a calendar with the photographs, and I explained like what I was trying to do, and I said I wanted elegant photographs. and elegant wouldn't be a word used in it every day sort of thing, you know. So I was sitting at one point and I was waiting on to be filmed for the TV. And this woman, probably about 70, she was standing across. I seen her looking at me, and then she came across, and I was sitting in a chair, and she was foreign, but she'd lived here she was like from Sweden or Norway, that sort of thing. But she had lived here for 30, 40 years. She says, I just want to say, sir, you look extremely elegant.
Oh, yay.
I said, I was really tickled, and I says, well, thank you, madam. I said, madam, because she said, I says, you wouldn't believe these were made out of a prison blanket. And she says, get away. I says, yes. I says, it's a blanket during the period of protest in the jail, and I was on it, got this. And she says, oh, I remember those days, they were very, very tough days, but you came through it, and I want to say again, you look extremely elegant.
Yes.
And I was really, really moved.
Yes.
You know? Yeah. So it was great, and I ended up on RTE, like the radio program, the arts program did it, and Irish Times, which is made. So it was interesting how by presenting, because as soon as I was asked, and so East Coast, where did East Coast come from? As well, I come from the blanket, protest, hunger strike. So you bring out the whole story.
Yeah, it's all right.
But it's done through arts, and somehow it seems okay. Yeah. And okay, times have moved on since then. But the idea was to subvert that image, to say that we've lived on through it, we survived that. We're proud of her today. And actually, one of the women who was photographed in it, she just died there 2 weeks ago. So it's like,
wow.
She died. It shows you the importance of documenting, particularly the women's story, because they never get the same coverage.
Oh yeah.
Of actually engaging in that type of thing. And funny, Mary Neelis, the woman I was talking about there earlier, who had the sons in it, whenever I first said to her about it, she says, "No, Laurence, I'm not so sure. It sounds a wee bit, a calendar, are we sort of?" She thought maybe trivialising things a wee bit. And then when she did it, she says, "I'm delighted I did it.
Oh, good.
I didn't see." Yeah. What would be the impact, you know? So that's how a lot of the art stuff happened, and then we got out of jail, and me and Brian wanted to write a film about the hunger strike called H3, and then we started to work as a playwright and doing everything else at the same time. And Brian tragically died 2005. He was only 45, and I continued on doing my own stuff. And ours has been to use the arts, and particularly theatre, or film too, to raise a lot of the issues that are there. It's a safe place to raise issues. And it humanises people. I mean, the last play I did, and you've met Will Glendenning, who is from a very different background than me, Protestant Unionist, former UDR man. But we've worked over the years, and he gathered oral history of former servant RUC officers and Garda Síochána, which is the police in the south of Ireland, and I wrote a play about their experience on the border, which people find very funny of my background, that I'm writing about them, but all the reviews of the play itself have been excellent. And
it's an amazing play. It's truly so powerful.
Yeah, we talked about how much it really challenged our own assumptions and thinking, and it humanizes. It humanizes. But you've done an incredible job of basically moving through every question we possibly came up with to ask you. And this feels like a really incredible place to land, which is like when we came and we saw the play that night, we were like, how do you get from being, a prisoner of war and going through the experience you went to writing this play? And you spoke about Che Guevara's quote, "True revolutionaries are guided by feelings of love." And I'd love for you to end us there, to land us there, just like, how did you get there, and what do you see as the potential outcomes of doing that humanizing work?
Well, I suppose the prison protests, apart from saying educationally, how you rethink your thinking on so many levels, and I suppose one of the things, particularly a lot of work I actually do is with women and women roles. I mean, Green and Blue is male, but a lot of the other things I'm generally writing is female roles, and it's about and Joanna, who you met and coming to jail and did stuff. So you start to, I suppose, if you become aware of your own oppression and how you're being brutalized, then you have to think. And it's a very simple thing. And probably my parents probably told me growing up, like, I mean, to treat others the way you want to be treated yourself, you know. And it is a very simple philosophy. And my father would have said, no, if you can't do someone a good turn, never do them a bad one.
Yeah.
And if you internalize that, it's about saying, well, you know, people depending on, you know, their birth, their parents, their community, their situation, then that's the things that decide them in a particular way, but they're ordinary people like yourself. So it was, I suppose that would have been a big sort of lesson at that time, of becoming conscious of how you engage with other people. Even, and I think it's to our credit, after the whole protests, that we had a particular approach in the jail, and we ended up writing I wrote a charter for our wings, which was for the prisoners that, you know, everyone are entitled to be there, and like it's never physical brutality or sexual assault or anything at all, but also in terms of the prison guards, that they come under the wing. We don't respect their badge or the uniform that they wear, but as people will respect them and their right to come on the wing, and they want a cup of tea, coffee, how you want to read a book, go and read a book, you want to go to the yard, do whatever you want until the wing. You won't be touched at all on it until you start to try to harass or oppress us, and if you do, we will use anything bar nothing to stop you. And most of them went, that's fine with me. So it's recognised that there's a human there, but there's the, and we ended up with, prison guards prefer to work on our wings rather than loyalist wings. So it was then, I suppose,
that's interesting.
Getting out of jail and continuing that work, continue to develop also, and see that you can't be driven by hate. And thankfully, probably was a time, not probably, during the protest, where probably I hated in a way I'd never hated in my life before, at the degree of it. And then you realise that's not affecting anybody else other than myself, you know. That's just, and large things was a pettiness, and it's a thing which would still rage at today when I see it, of pettiness, and particularly of bureaucracies, and that thing of power. And I was in New York about one time going into America, and I need a special visa to get into America, and you go through the whole process, and I got it, and stamp at the State Department and everything else, and then I arrived in Washington, ironically, to speak on feminism at a International Studies Association. Gets pulled in at the airport, and the guy's sort of almost outraged. What's this, an Irish terrorist here to speak on feminism? I'm just taken off this room where this elderly Sri Lankan guy, an Indian guy, are brought in, and the real aggression of the guards. And it's and the ones who I happen to be seeing, red or black or Hispanic, and male and female. And it was all with these other guys, but aggressively, do you speak English, and just really over them, and my attitude was, I'm here legally, they want to put me back on a plane to Ireland, no big deal, I'm always back home again, I'm here an invite, and then how it changes, and it's good to be back in that situation where you realise the power again of there, and then obviously someone sat down and went, okay, why are we holding this guy McKeown? Because he has a passport, he's English, he's white, he's got permission. And then it changes to Dr. McKeown. Is there anybody in our side but you we could contact? And then that became Laurence, and at the bottom. And I'm more or less trying to keep them at a distance. I'm with these guys. I'm not part of your.
You're like, I'm over here with this dude.
And bring my bag and show me the bag that's okay. And there's almost now a fear on their part that they have messed up, and now is this white doctor?
Oh, we marginalised the wrong person.
And you're thinking, like, and once they go off duty in the streets of Washington. By our communities, they're going to be seen as piece of shit, or whatever, because they're working class people, they're black, Hispanic, whatever else. I'm becoming aware of just the ideas of, regardless of the situation, that idea of power, how some people try to cling on to this or grab at this sort of elusive thing of power. And probably I can understand why it happens in their lives. So suddenly they're in a position where they have a wee bit of power. We've seen it in the jail with prison guards who on the outside were nothing, but now they're in jail. They have the keys. There's a point whenever they're in charge, and then that point goes, and then suddenly it's like, oh God, how did that happen? So I suppose all of those things that have helped me over the years to say that you shouldn't be embittered. You should be proud of what you come through, and the goal must be a better society, isn't it? And there's people who today will totally oppose you, and if tomorrow they come around till seeing things differently, then you befriend them. You don't go, oh, I remember 20 years ago you did this for 30. Like, we've all made mistakes. We've always had different levels of consciousness at one stage.
Yeah.
And I do think that quote of Guevara's is, well, the whole number is great, like, let's be realistic and attempt the impossible,
exactly.
which I think is great.
Let's be realistic and attempt the impossible.
Yeah.
I think
But then also like Emma Goldman, I used to use that in my emails all the time about, if I can't dance, I don't want to be part of your revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Because, I mean, Bobby's quote was, let our revenge be the laughter of our children. And I thought, again, for someone in those conditions to be able to think outside of the box.
Exactly.
And there's not hatred, there's no anger, there's no nothing else. It's like, it's envisaging a better society.
Yeah.
And you can't say, well, it's a better society for us, but it's not going to be the unionists, and there's not going to be the new immigrants, there's not going to be the gays, there's not going to be, you can't, it's a new society, there's no ifs, buts, sub-clauses, or anything else, I think that's what our goal to be, and I think that, well, it's like you've been here, or I've been in other countries, and across Europe, Eastern Europe, and in South Africa, and you meet people, and you're just on the same wavelength, because you don't even have to go into a big explanation once you say, and why I spoke at length. But people who have been through those struggles just get it. They can end your sentences for you, you can end their sentences for them. It's depression is the same the world over, discrimination is the same, manifest maybe in different ways, but we know what it is. And it's about how, in solidarity, I think it was one of the big lessons that we learned. Nearly one of the Republican movement learned, that they suddenly became aware that other parts of the world were looking on them. Mandela and Robben Island going on solidarity hunger strikes because us Palestinians didn't see them. You suddenly go, wow, people are the same as now. We look to others as well, and it's what needed, because imperialism and capitalism is united, and it's war to keep us all suppressed. So we must be united, and
Thank you for listening to this podcast. Thank you to Laurence and Will, and thank you so much to the entire team at AISHT for bringing us to Belfast and Derry and South Armagh and all over Northern Ireland. We really, really appreciated it. We cannot wait to get back. We've got links about Laurence and the conflict at our site, intotheworldshow.org. While you're there, you can find a link to support us financially via Patreon if you feel compelled. How to Survive the End of the World is produced by the delightful daddy, Zach Rosen. The music is from Tunde Olaniran and Mother Cyborg. And we'll see you next time.